Now, the next main thing, which is photography modes. We learned what are the three factors which control the exposure, but we need to know how and when to use it and what's the best mode to use. You pick up any camera, be it a beginner DSLR or a high-end mirrorless or a digital SLR camera. All of these have these four modes when it comes to taking out a photograph, which is program mode, aperture priority, which is designated by A or AV, shutter priority, which is designated by S or TV, and the manual mode. Most of you guys who have been watching this video, you might be one of them who might have always used auto mode in your camera, and you're a thought like, okay, why is the photograph not coming the way I want it? Why is that I'm not having that creative control on the images that I'm shooting? The answer for that question is because you're not using one of these modes, which will allow you to control all the variables and get the image that you want. All cameras come with automatic mode, and there are pre-designated automatic modes, things like for portrait, for landscape, for action, for macro. There are so many predefined automatic modes which are available in the camera. At the end of the day, it's the camera's decision when it comes to the image that is getting captured when you're using automatic mode. But if you want that finer or the maximum control on your camera, and that's exactly the reason why you're watching this particular video and learning all these things so that you can have the control on the image that you are taking, then you need to be using one of these modes. I would, as much as possible, say avoid the program mode, which we'll be talking about in just a bit. And I would also go on to say that now itself that you need to be using manual mode, but don't get petrified. We'll go through what these modes are, why I'm telling you to use a certain mode, and why I'm telling you not to use a certain mode. Photography modes are also your stepping stone in understanding how you use the three main variables which you just learned, which is aperture, shutter priority, and ISO, and how to use them to get a correct exposure. I told you in early part of the video like how the cameras are designed. So when it comes to the automatic modes, the camera is designed to read the reflected light from the subject, and based on the light tonality, what it does, it converts it into mid-tone values. So this is what happens when you're shooting in automatic. If you're shooting a very bright scene, it'll make sure that it'll try to make it mid-tone. If you're shooting a very dark scene, it'll try to make sure that it is pushed towards mid-tone. So that's automatic mode to you. And if you noticed, I mentioned a while back that try to avoid using program mode. So program mode is no better than an automatic mode, but the only advantage being that when it comes to the regular automatic modes that are there in your camera, you don't have an option of controlling anything, be it the type of picture style that you use, be it the type of the file type that you use, like whether you want a JPEG or you want a RAW, or not even things like you can't even control stuff around like aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. But when it comes to program mode, it's slightly what you can call it like an advanced auto, but still again, avoid it. You can decide on the things like you want to shoot RAW or JPEG. You can decide on what ISO you want to shoot with and things like that. But what the camera does here is based on the metering mode that you have used, the camera will calculate the exposure that is required to get a correct exposure, and it will suggest you a specific aperture and a shutter combination. So the camera is taking the decision of determining what aperture the photograph will be taken in, and also the shutter speed that will be used. Maybe you're shooting action sports and probably you're shooting it at say late in the evening. The camera doesn't know that shooting at a very slow shutter speed will cause motion blur or anything. So it'll go by its own logic and how it is designed to work. But the other three modes that we will be learning now, which is the aperture priority, shutter priority, and also the manual mode, which is the most important mode that I want you to learn here, is where you can get the maximum control on the image that you're taking. Now let's go one by one. What happens in aperture priority? In aperture priority, wherein you keep the camera dial on the top in A or AV mode, you have the control of determining what ISO you want the photograph to be taken in, and also you can decide on the aperture that you want to shoot the photograph in. Based on these combination, the camera will automatically calculate the shutter speed that you need, and this is also based on the metering mode that I mentioned to you. So say like you want to shoot a particular subject which is in broad daylight, and you've probably chosen say 100 ISO, and you're trying to shoot in f2.8 or f4. So based on the metering, the camera decide what is the shutter speed that you want, and it will allow you to shoot a photograph in it. The challenge here is that the shutter speed is a variable which is controlled by the camera, not by you. So camera is determining what shutter speed it needs. You can override it by using what is known as exposure compensation. We'll come to that in a few slides from now. But just remember that in aperture priority, you have the control of the aperture in which the photograph needs to be taken. The camera will help you with the shutter speed based on the scene and the metering mode that you have used. Now, having said that, if you go to shutter priority, which is usually designated by TV or S on your camera dial, you have the ability to choose the shutter speed and the ISO in which you want to take the photograph, and the camera will suggest you the aperture based on the scene and also the metering mode that you are using. Now, you set your camera to say about 1 by 500th of a second because you want to freeze an action, and probably you would have chosen say like ISO 100 or 200. And based on the light that is available in the scene and also the metering mode, as I told you, the camera will suggest a particular aperture which will enable you to get a mid-tone exposure. Now again, you can override this by using what is known as exposure compensation. The last mode is the manual mode, which is designated by the letter M, and which is what I would suggest you need to learn so that you have the maximum control on the image that you're shooting. What happens in the manual mode is that the entire camera is under your control, all the settings. So you can determine what ISO that you're shooting in, you can determine what aperture that you're shooting in, and you can determine what is the shutter speed that you will be shooting in. So what I always tell, be it in this video or any of the workshop that I conduct, is always decide what is the image that you want to photograph. Whether it's a portrait that you want to shoot, whether it's a landscape that you want to shoot, whether it's an action that you want to shoot, or whether it's a motion blur that you want to achieve in a landscape scene. All these things based on whether you're shooting at day or night, indoor or outdoor. You know what's the aperture, what's the shutter speed, and what's the ISO that you need based on your learning just a while back. You can feed in these values to the camera and you can take the photographs and get the desired result that you want. The manual mode is where you have the maximum control on the image that you shoot.